want to talk about the Unit 3, and basically communication. Communication provides the components of communication models, the various types of communication, the way communication satisfies the need, and the difference between communication and communications. Throughout the chapter, I thought three most important subjects that we're going to talk about later. I'm going to start with the 5 principles of communication. The factors are: communication is irreversible, communication is contextual, communication is complicated, symbolic, and irreversible. We're going to start with communication is inescapable. Communication, no matter where you go, you're going to communicate. Whether through Zoom, email, text message, DM, you name it, a letter, you're going to communicate, and you have to communicate to get ahead. You have to. There's no running away from it. With that, communication is also irreversible. When you say something, post something, it's on there forever. So I believe that once you say something, that's what you mean. You have to stand by it. You have to. Next thing, communication is very complicated depending on where you're from, the experience. Different cultures may see something different. And that's when symbolic. That's why communication is very symbolic, depending on where you're from, what you're talking about. We're going to talk about that later in the speech. Communication is very symbolic, and you need communication to be symbolic, so you can get other people that don't culturally talk like you understand what you're talking about, which is where you're coming from. Lastly, one of the most important things, communication is contextual. Just because depending on how you say something, it can be interpreted so many different ways, meaning that let's say you said something with an attitude and it may have crossed rude and disrespectful. You didn't mean it that way, it's just because of the way you said it. Next thing we're going to talk about is the rules and norms of communication. Whether it's verbal or nonverbal, meditated or interpersonal, communication is guided by rules and norms. Emphatic communion is an interactive example of how we communicate under a set of beyond the influence and the rules and norms. For example, you walk in, you walk home, you open the door, you see your neighbor, you say, hi, how you doing, neighbor? He says, I'm good, how are you? And I say, I'm good. Boom, emphatic communion. That's the rules and norms. Rules and norms are the thing. Next thing we're going to talk about is communication is very learned. Lastly, communication without a doubt is a learned art. Most, if not everybody, is born with the ability to communicate in some different way. I know not everybody can speak, but some people can use sign language, some people can draw, and some certain cultures have certain symbols they use to communicate. For example, if I wanted to go to, in my culture, we call chicken, chicken. If I went to somewhere in Central America and they call it El Pollo, meaning for people who don't know, El Pollo means chicken. If I mean El Pollo, they're not gonna understand. Americans are not gonna understand what El Pollo means unless, a symbolism comes in. So let's say they put El Pollo and they have a picture of a chicken next to it, and they can contextualize or see like, oh, El Pollo must mean chicken. So that's why another thing, communication is a learned art. It's absolutely associated with chicken. So that's an example of one way communication is basically symbolism. And that's the one I want to get to. So in conclusion, I realize that communication is not as simple as everyone thinks it is. It's not as simple as talking back and forth with somebody. I believe the definition of communication is transferring information verbally or non-verbally, so the person can understand where you're coming from. I compare my definition to textbooks as the textbook is being a little bit too complex and very hard to understand. But yeah, that's my 3 important factors of communication. I want to say thank you guys for listening, and you guys have a good one.